Yes, we'll do that too. Didn't mean to startle you. Good evening, everyone. My name is Brad Smith, and I want to welcome all of you to the second session of the 76th year that the Amos Fortune Forum has been having presentations here in the Meeting House. As is my habit, I will be very brief with just a few housekeeping items and remarks. A few thank yous first to Tony Gildone and Sam Green. Thank you very much for contributing to the flowers this evening. And I also want to thank Liz Tong and Val Atkins, who have been organizing and will put on the reception afterwards. Everyone here is invited after the presentation tonight to go across the way for some light refreshments, to meet with the speaker, to ask him all kinds of questions, ask them all kinds of questions, and socialize with your friends. And it probably will be a little warm by then, so we'll have some cold water and lemonade for you there. I also want to point out that there are a number of these cards at your seat and by the doors. Please take them with you. Fill them out if you want to here. You can also bring them home, and there are these QR codes on it. You can just use the camera on your phone, take a click of it, and it will send you to a menu where you can go to our website, you can provide feedback to us, you can give us your contact information to get on our mailing list, you can make a donation. And to that point, hopefully as you came in, you saw some of the logos of our local businesses who have been incredibly generous in supporting the Amos Fortune Forum. There are also a number of you who've made individual donations. We really, really appreciate it. You also have the opportunity to make a donation to our begging bowls at each of the doors. Since 1946, the Amos Fortune Forum has been free and open to everyone, and it's our commitment to keep it that way. I also want to point out that we are now live streaming the evening presentations, so I'm just going to leave it down there. So if you have friends and family who are not in the Monadnock region and they would like to participate, they can. You just go to our website. There's a link live. And, good Lord willing, the live streaming will work, and you can watch it in real time. Or if you can't make it, or your friends can't make it, record it and we'll post it there so you can watch it later as well. We've also started putting chairs out back. We weren't sure about the weather this evening. It turned out to be quite nice. If you would like, you can always bring come early, enjoy the area and the green, or we are projecting it as well. So I think that covers everything. What I'd like to do now is introduce to you Andrea Walsh, who will give her introduction.
Thank you. Good evening. My name is Andrea Walsh. Humans are our stories. We share spaces, we breathe in and out together, and we become part of each other's stories. Tonight, it is my honor to introduce Andy Davis, storyteller. 24 years ago, this past Monday, spoiler alert, This is a spoiler alert. Andy and I committed to joining our stories. At our wedding, we promised to be each other's comfort and entertainment. Through the time I've known him, Andy has taken a passion for community building and homemade fun, from the realm of joke telling and sharing jokes to becoming a real storyteller. May you enjoy this time we share together tonight with my favorite entertainer, Andy Davis, storyteller.
Thanks, Brad. Thanks, Andrea. Can you all hear me all right? I'm so indescribably happy that you're here this evening. Thank you for coming. Andrea first caught my eye when we were both living in Guatemala. And she came into a room in the Northern Highlands where a bunch of gringos and Guatemaltecos were sitting around together. And she made sure everyone had what they needed. And then she went into the corner, sat down and picked up her knitting. And I looked across at her with her kind face wreathed in shining dark hair and her talented hands. And I said, I'd like to get to know that woman. Andrea's version of the same event is that she looked across at me, laughing a little too loud and taking up a little too much space, and said, I could be attracted to that guy, and it wouldn't be a good idea. Well, I'm happy to report that we did get to know each other. And after she had done a thorough background check and begun to semi-domesticate me and decided that she just might keep me, she chose to express her burgeoning love in the way truest to her 4-H heart, by knitting me a sweater. So she went to Momostenango, the sheep capital of Guatemala, and came away with an armload of hand-spun, hand-dyed skeins of wool of the most glorious shade of blue. And she went right to it with her needles. We were doing human rights work, so there were countless interminable meetings during which she was able to knit the back. And she knit the front while observing the polls during the historic 1992 elections in El Salvador. And then while sandwiched between country people and their chickens on buses out to refugee camps and in the camps themselves, she knit one sleeve and part of another. And when the time came for us to leave Guatemala in the end, she finished the second sleeve on the way across the grand landscape of Mexico. And she knit in the ends while we were racing on greyhounds across the lower 48. So that when the time came for us to go our separate ways to be with our respective families for Christmas, my sweater was complete. And it was an aesthetic marvel. The blue was the blue of a crisp, clear, cold winter morning in the White Mountains just before dawn. And it was a tactile delight as well. It had that knobbly, uneven texture of hand-spun yarn, and it retained some of the remnants of burrs and other vegetative matter that the sheep had encountered. and the lanolin was redolent of the sheep themselves. When I put it on, I felt like I was wearing an enchanted web. It was like one of those magical garments you encounter in folk tales. Well, Andrea's plan was to go out to Chicago after Christmas to begin work with another human rights organization. My plan was to go over to Vermont to work for a guy I had pruned apple trees before, prune an orchard, and put together a little pile of cash to have with me when we began our new life together. But before heading to Vermont, as the dutiful son, I stuck around at my mother's house up the road here in Antrim, New Hampshire, to help her with a few projects around the house. And one night, after I finished what I was working on that day, I thought I just might go down the road to the Folkway to hear Bill Morrissey sing about how cold it was in Barstow. But I couldn't find my magical folktale garment. Mom, have you seen my sweater? It's drying between two towels, Andy. I washed it. You washed it? Andy, you have to wash things. You smelled like a goat. Well, it seemed impolite to correct my well-meaning mother that actually, no, Mom, I smelled like a sheep. But her good intentions hadn't ruined my sweater. They had just made it a little more fitted, the way they wore sweaters when she was a girl growing up in the 1940s. The very last thing I did before going to Vermont was I got together with my buddy Fender for a beer, and he presented me with a rectangular package. I ripped open the paper. It said, "A Dog Puncher on the Yukon" by Arthur T. Walden. Fender said, "Andy, I know you and I share a love of those Arctic adventure stories. Well, this guy Walden, he was from New Hampshire. He went up to the Klondike during the gold rush in the 1890s. Andy, no matter how cold, hungry, and tired you get pruning apple trees, Walden had it worse." So I looked into this Walden character. He had grown up in Minnesota and been sent to military school for the reason lots of high-spirited young lads get sent to military school. But it didn't take. And so at the age of 19, he accompanied his Episcopal clergyman father east to Boston, where the elder Walden had been posted rector at St. Paul's Cathedral. But the younger Walden hightailed it out of the Athens of America as quickly as possible, up to the southeast corner of the White Mountains where we live now, to a place called Wonalancet, which in those days was still known as the Birch Intervale. And back then, it was a full-on farming community. Back when farming still meant doing a lot of the mowing with scythes, and the heavy work, the plowing and such, was done by oxen and horses. And Walden had experience with draft animals and was good with them. So he found a place for himself there in the Birch Intervale in the shadow of the Sandwich Range. He also found a place for himself at the side of a slightly older woman, a diminutive dynamo, a local mover and shaker named Kate Sleeper. And Kate had this idea to open an inn to cater to this new thing they called summer people. And she wondered if Arthur would run the farm end of things for her. Well, he would, And in time, their professional relationship developed. And as a gesture of their growing affection, when Arthur turned 21, Kate presented him with a fluffy little collie puppy, a boy dog, but he named him Shirley after Shirley Hill in Goffstown, where the dog had come from. And in time, Shirley grew to be as intelligent as he was fluffy, and he became Arthur's chief sidekick and assistant in running the farm. It was Shirley that kept the oxen going straight in their traces. It was Shirley that carried the jug of switchel out to the workers in the hay fields. It was Shirley that passed notes back and forth between Arthur and Kate. And Arthur even managed to teach him to climb ladders so that Kate could send tools up to him when he was building the second floor on the inn, because Kate didn't much care for ladders herself. Well, as happy as Arthur was there with Kate and Shirley, he had a fiery, irrepressible nature that was hard to contain in a 19th-century New Hampshire farm town. And he felt gnawing at him that age-old yearning of youth to leave behind all that had been part of his life up to that point and step off the edge of the known world to prove his mettle. And he didn't much care where he did it. So, the winter when he was 24, one evening in front of the fireplace in the inn parlor, with only Shirley as his witness, he tossed a coin in the air, and heads was to be South Africa, but tails would be Alaska. You might have already guessed, it came up tails. So in the spring of 1896, with Kate's blessing, Kate gave him a professional leave of absence, and personally, she said she'd wait for him. So Arthur went to Boston with Shirley at his side, and there they got on a train headed west to Minneapolis, where they did some visiting, and then they got on the Great Northern Railway, the brand spanking new Empire Builder passenger train that took them to Seattle. And in Seattle, they boarded a 200-foot steamship named the City of Topeka that took them up the Inside Passage to Juneau, where they bought supplies and gear, and then they took a tugboat further in the inlet to a place called Dyea. And there they set off on foot on the old Tlingit trading route from the coast to the interior, over Chilkoot Pass, which in a few months after the gold strike at Bonanza Creek in August of that year, 100,000 more economic refugees and adventurers, mostly from the lower 48, would follow them over that route. But at this particular time, they were largely solitary. It was just a man and his dog in harness together, pulling a single sled as the terrain got more and more steep, until eventually Arthur had to begin to cut steps in the glacier with his axe, and it got so steep that he could reach out and almost touch the path in front of him, and the sled threatened to pull them back the way they had come. But they made it to the top, to the pass, and were able to look out on a landscape that until that moment had existed for Arthur only in myth. He looked into his future in the vast, boundless, almost uncharted watershed of the Yukon River. Meanwhile, almost exactly 100 years in the future, I was beginning my work in an apple orchard in Westminster, Vermont, overlooking the Connecticut River. I had my work cut out for me. I had a fairly large orchard of semi-dwarf trees, McCowns, McIntoshes, Baldwins, Northern Spies, that I wanted finished in the month of February so I could be reunited with Andrea. And the weather wasn't cooperating. By which I mean it was a good old-fashioned winter. The highs were up in the mid-teens during the day and the lows wobbled on either side of zero at night. It seemed to be snowing about every other day, so from morning until dusk, I dragged my 14-foot pointed apple ladder through prodigious snowdrifts from tree to tree, making occasional big cuts with a chainsaw, but mostly innumerable, countless smaller cuts with a handsaw, especially cutting out the suckers, the vertical leafy growth, so that the trees could put all their dormant energy into dreaming up blossoms, which in June would begin to become apples. At the end of the day, I dragged my boots back to the 10 by 12 cabin on the edge of the orchard where I was staying. And despite the cold, sometimes I just didn't have the energy to light the wood stove. I just heat up my beans and bacon on my little backpacking stove, and then I'd drape my parka over the one chair and kick off my sorrels and climb up the ladder into my squalid nest in the loft under my winter sleeping bag and light the candle lantern to read a few paragraphs of Walden's book before my eyelids slammed shut for the night. I read that when Walden got into the Yukon, he found that almost all the important work that needed to be done for at least 8 months of the year was done by dogs and the men who knew how to work with them. As it had been done for 4,000 years since the First Nations people had first teamed up with the progeny of wolves. Walden learned that a team of dogs weighing 600 pounds could haul more gear farther under more extreme conditions than a 1,000-pound horse. And of all the animals that Walden knew and loved, he loved dogs most. He often said, "The dog is the only creature that followed Adam and Eve out of the Garden of Eden." And while his clergyman father might have quibbled with the theological accuracy of that statement, I think a lot of us could resonate with its emotional truth. So Walden made of himself what was known in the parlance of the day as a dog puncher. He became effectively the engineer of a steam engine of dogs hauling 3 sleds laden with up to 1,500 pounds on a 1,000-mile track from Skagway in the Alaskan Panhandle, northwest across the Yukon, all the way to Circle City, Alaska, where ships could come in bringing supplies from the Bering Sea at least a few months of the year. He and his dogs hit every way station, trading post, mining camp, bringing supplies and mail, but also news and stories, which in time became the history and folklore of the Klondike Gold Rush. He lived his life in a cacophony of yips and barks and the whoosh of sled runners under the mother blue of the sky. And he became known as an artist at working with dogs and at training them. And the magic kernel at the center of his technique was that though firm, he treated them with the love and respect that he felt was their due, having been the only creature whose ancestors followed our ancestors out of paradise when they were driven out by an angel with a flaming sword. There's also an artistry in apple tree pruning. In the most extreme of cases, you're taking something that looks like the tangled thicket of a disordered, troubled mind, and you're transmogrifying it into an optimistic spirit open to the sun. So I found satisfaction in that work, and I love to be out in the elements all day. But I was a little lonely. I wasn't seeing anybody. I wasn't even seeing any animals. It got so that I looked forward to hearing the mice skittering around in the dark in my cabin at night. Of course, above all, I missed Andrea. I yearned for her. I wanted to be with her so much. I remember one day I came back so tired from work and I only wanted Andrea's touch. And of course, I couldn't be with her. So I thought, well, at least I'll be able to cuddle up with the sweater she made for me. But I couldn't find it anywhere. I couldn't find it where I expected to, and I couldn't find it where I didn't expect to. I turned over everything in the cabin, and it just wasn't there. This was a disaster. Just imagine, this is as if I had lost a valuable diamond engagement ring. Worse, you heard how many hundreds of hours she poured herself into that sweater, how she had put so much of herself in that sweater that each stitch was like a lasting woolen kiss, and I had lost it. Where could it possibly be? Had I left it someplace? The truth is, I hadn't gone anywhere. Except every few days when I had a little juice left at the end of the working day, I'd brave the cold and the dark and go a mile down the hill to Route 5 where there was a convenience store where a lonely payphone stood out in front. I'd go down there, I'd position myself in front of the payphone. I don't know if you remember, it's a while ago now, but most of those old payphones didn't really have a flat surface associated with them. So it took a certain amount of juggling and choreography to make even the shortest phone call. I would start by dropping my mittens to the ground in front of me. And then I'd get out Andrea's number on a scrap of paper. And then I'd pick up the receiver and pinch it between my ear and shoulder, that's my shoulder, And then with that hand freed, I would dig out a fistful of change and drop 1 quarter in the slot, which would immediately be spit back at me, and then the grumpy woman's voice would come on and say, please deposit 55 cents for the first 3 minutes. So I'd carefully separate out those 3 coins and drop them in. And if all went well, Andrea and I got to whisper sweet nothings in each other's ears until our time ran out. And almost invariably, toward the end of the call, Andrea would eventually say, honey, is that sweater keeping you warm? And that phone call, when I realized it had turned up missing, I artfully replied, oh, schnookums, just the thought of that sweater is keeping me warm. But as I walked back up the hill after the call, I couldn't help feeling just a little unworthy to have prevaricated, even in that small way, to the woman who was becoming the love of my life, the woman who had knit me a sweater in 4 countries. I mean, she had gone into this relationship with a healthy degree of skepticism about the male species. And so as the woman in the relationship, she figured that de facto she was the grown-up in the relationship. What would she do when she realized that I had borne out her worst expectations? Of course, the first thing she'd have to do, the logical thing to do, would be to decide that her first instinct had been correct and it had indeed been a mistake to be attracted to that guy. As you can see, I was spinning into a snow squall of anxiety and self-doubt when I remembered what Fender had said to me when he gave me the book. Andy, whatever you're going through, Walden had it worse. So as I got back to the cabin, I hoped that when I opened the book that night, I would find Walden and the dogs in the midst of some harrowing adventure that would take me out of my own perseveration on my own fear and doubt. And sure enough, they were caught in the middle of a blizzard, far from any way station. The storm had come down upon them so quickly, Walden hadn't had time to make camp. He had just bedded down in the snow in his sleeping robe, leaving the dogs to flop and body surf and maneuver for position on top of each other, each trying to be in the center of the ball, while Walden huddled in his furry cave, gnawing on frozen hardtack and bacon and sawing off pieces with his sheath knife and tossing them out to the dogs, hoping for an equitable distribution of resources so that all the dogs would make it through the night. And I just wondered, I tried to imagine how it was for those dogs who have such a very different conception of time than we do. How would they be able to imagine that that horrible night would ever come to an end? Then I thought, of course, they had been with us so long. They'd do what we do to shorten the night. They'd tell each other stories. Stories of great dogs of yore. And since surely the collie was one of their number, surely he would tell them an old Scottish tale, like the one about McPhee's black dog. Back in the days when what was to be feared most didn't always come in human form. In the Western Hebrides, On the Isle of Colonsay, there lived a man named McPhee. Now, one time, McPhee was out hunting in a place he'd never been before. And when darkness fell, there was no house in sight, except for one. So he knocked on the door, and the door was opened to him by an old man. And McPhee greeted his host, but looked beyond him and saw in the corner a big, sleek, beautiful black dog, which evidently had given birth to a litter of pups maybe a couple of weeks before. And McPhee took a shine to one of the pups in particular and asked if he might have him. And his host responded, "Oh, you can have any of the pups you like except that one." And McPhee said, "That's the one I'll have and none other." And his host said, "Well, if that's the one you will have, that's the one you shall have. But in all his life, he'll do you but one day's service. But that one day, he'll serve you well indeed." So the next day, McPhee took the dog home under his arm. And the pup grew up to be as sleek and beautiful and powerful as his mother. But there was one thing. Whenever there was any hunting to be done or any work at all, the dog would go to the door, sniff the air, turn tail, lie down again beside the hearth, and not move again for the rest of the day. So that all McPhee's friends and relations said, "You should get rid of the dog. The dog's not worth the food you feed it." And McPhee would say, "Hold your tongue. The black dog's day will come." But there must have been times when he wanted nothing more than to be out in the world with his dog at his side, and the dog would sniff the air, turn tail, lie down again beside the hearth, and not move, leaving him to pull his plaid around him and go off alone, when he might have started to heed the words of his friends and relations. But one day, McPhee was down at the strand preparing his boat to go hunting on a nearby island. And he paused in his labors to admire the beauty of the day, the blue of the sky and the white clouds scudding across it and the sunlight glinting on the waves. And then he turned to look back up the hill toward his own dwelling. And there, silhouetted against the sky, bounding down the hill toward him, looking fierce and determined as never before, was the black dog. And the black dog reached the edge of the water and was in the boat in a single bound. And McPhee nodded to himself and said, the black dog's day is near at hand. Well, the hunt that day went fairly well. But McPhee was just happy to be afoot in the world with his dog running ahead of him and behind him and at his side. But when evening came, a cold fog settled over the land as the weather changed. And so McPhee and the dog sought shelter in a shieling, a shepherd's hut made of stone. And McPhee made a fire, fed himself and the dog, and then banked the coals, pulled his plaid up to his nostrils, and went to sleep. But sometime in the night, he came half awake to hear the dog snarling and barking. And his eyes came half open, and he could begin to distinguish strange, macabre hand shadows in the dim light that remained from the fire on the wall of the hut. And as the dog continued to growl and yip, he came fully awake and opened his eyes to realize that what was making those hand shadows was a long, powerful arm like a human's, only longer, with gnarled yellow claws at the end. And it was reaching down through the smoke hole, swooping and scooping as if it was reaching for him. McPhee backed against the wall of the shieling, wishing for his broadsword. And the dog gave one final growl and launched himself upward, and with his jaws seized the upper arm of the creature, and the creature gave a bellow and withdrew his arm. And the last thing McPhee saw of his dogs was the wheeling, thrashing hindquarters as his dog was lifted through the smoke hole and was gone. Now, I'd like to be able to tell you that the dog came trotting back, proudly brandishing the grisly severed arm of the creature, and that McPhee in his turn had taken the arm home and proudly mounted over the fireplace, and the dog had resumed an honored place at the hearth. But that's not the way it happened. In the safety of daylight, McPhee went outside and searched outward in ever-widening circles from the shieling, and found no trace of the creature or his dog. The black dog had done his one-day service and was gone. So when I awoke the following morning and remembered the story that I had imagined Shirley telling the other dogs the night before, I thought how true it is that all of us, whether humans or dogs, whether we're pruning apple trees or pulling sleds, we live our lives in front of a backdrop colored by the grand deeds of those who have gone before. And I want to be worthy of my illustrious forebears. But if Kate Walden had knit a fabulous masterwork of Ariadnic artistry for Arthur T. Walden, he wouldn't have thoughtlessly, carelessly, fecklessly lost it, would he? I ask you. Well, I couldn't allow myself to spin into another whirlpool of fear and self-worry. I had work to do. I was getting towards the end of that orchard, and it was reaching the time when maybe I'd be able to finish up and go out and be reunited with Andrea, come what may. Besides, I had other questions for Arthur T. Walden. Details that he left out. Personal, emotional revelations that weren't part of his late Victorian era, Jack London inflected writing style. I wanted to know what it meant to him, how it changed him to be outside on one of the longest nights of the year in the 70-degree cold, looking up to watch the full moon trace an almost complete circle above him in the sky. I wanted to know how it affected him to be doused over and over again in all the colors of the northern lights so close to the pole. I wanted to know how he endured being so far from Kate for so very long. These and other questions were the ones that hung in the air as I continued to move through the orchard. I moved from tree to tree, leaving a pile of pickup sticks under each one. And eventually, I reached that furthest corner, and I made my last ladder set in the final tree. And I went up the ladder, and eventually I made the last cut through the base of the last sucker. And I watched that leafy wand topple end over end into the snow. And then I backed down the ladder, backed the ladder out of the tree, shouldered it for the last time, took it back to the cabin, leaned it outside, and went inside with the intention of reversing the Big Bang. Reversing the Big Bang that had emanated from my backpack to every corner of my 10 by 12 universe, putting it back into the backpack from whence it came. I dare an astrophysicist to accomplish a similar feat. Well, of course, as I did this, I hoped and expected that I would find my sweater. But it didn't turn up, as mystifying as that is. So with a heavy heart, I shouldered my backpack, left the cabin, closed the door for the last time, and went down the hill to Route 5 to the house of the guy I was working for, delivered my report, and accepted my check. And then I walked across the bridge to Route 12 on my way to hitch back over to my mother's house in Antrim to reorganize my things and have a little visit with her before going out to be reunited with Andrea. It took me one ride to Keene, and as I came in sight of Mount Monadnock, a shaft of sunlight came through the clouds and lit up the summit like one of those providential visions in 19th-century nature paintings. And my heart lightened just a little bit. One more ride got me to Peterborough, and one ride after that got me up to Antrim. And I walked through my mother's door, set down my pack, gave her a big hug, gave her a kiss on the cheek, and then went straight into the bathroom with the idea of taking off every stitch of clothing, taking every stitch of clothing out of my backpack, putting it all in the washing machine, putting myself into a long hot shower, because Andy, you have to wash things. And I threw off my parka and began to pick up the anorak that was under it, and my knuckles felt a familiar nubbly texture of hand-spun yarn. I pulled it over my head and was almost blinded by a flash of a brilliant blue, the blue of a crisp, clear, cold winter morning just before dawn in the White Mountains. I had had the damn thing on the whole time. And Andrea would never need to know. Please don't tell her. Well, there's just a couple more ends to weave in. I'd like you to know what became of Arthur and Kate. After 6 long years in the Yukon, Arthur, with Shirley at his side, returned to Onalancet. And Kate had waited for him. So on December 9th, 1902, in front of that fireplace in the inn parlor where Arthur had tossed that fateful coin in the air all those years before, they were married with, Kate had around her neck a necklace that was made with the 12 gold nuggets Arthur had brought back from the Yukon. Apparently his complete fortune at that point. Well, Arthur settled down to a life of agricultural projects and construction projects and engineering projects for the benefit of himself and Kate and for the broader community at large. Kate and Arthur never had children, but they had puppies. Arthur took up breeding sled dogs. He brought the sport of sled dog racing back to New England. And so they lived a life in the cacophony of yips and barks of toddler puppies. They lived a joyous life, and in January of 1917, one of his dogs, Ningo, that happened to be, I believe, the granddaughter of one of Admiral Peary's dogs that had been with him to the North Pole, if you believe that Admiral Peary made it to the North Pole, but that's another story entirely. Ningo gave birth to a litter of 3 pups, cuddly little yellow dogs that grew to be as strong as they were yellow and as intelligent. And one of them in particular was remarkable, and Arthur named him after his lead dog, his favorite lead dog in the Arctic, Chinook. And Chinook turned out to be a sport of nature who was able to pass on his most notable characteristics to his progeny. He became the progenitor of the Chinook sled dog breed, which since 2009, thanks to an intrepid band of 4th graders, has been the state dog of the state of New Hampshire. Admiral Byrd, when he was putting together his first expedition to the Antarctic, contracted Chinook and Walden to train the dogs and the men who worked with them. And it was on that expedition, on the morning in January 1929 when he turned 12, that Chinook disappeared out on the ice and wasn't seen again. Like McPhee's black dog, he had done his service and was gone into the darkness to which we all return. Now, when I read the history of Tamworth, our town, of which Wanalancet is a part, which was written by a woman who knew Arthur and Kate, she revealed that Arthur was a bit of a raconteur. In front of that fireplace in the inn parlor in the evening, he would hold forth before neighbors and flatlanders alike, telling long, circuitous tales with varying degrees of fidelity to truthfulness, taking all kinds of sidetracks, trying his listeners' patience. But the only story it specifically mentioned was one that he used to tell, apparently, a favorite story about a very special sweater that Kate had knit for him before he went to the Antarctic. And then when he got to the camp at Little America, he thought he had lost it or had gotten stolen. He couldn't find it anywhere. He went out onto the ice for 5 weeks with just a few dogs and men and came back in and disrobed to find he had had the damn thing on the whole time. Isn't it funny how history repeats itself? How time just curls up like a dog in front of the fire and tucks its nose under its own tail. And speaking of tails, this one is finished. Thank you. Thank you. Thank you. You're so kind and so very patient. Well, I think we might have a couple of moments to talk before they whisk me over to the refreshments where we can also talk, of course. Does anyone have any questions, comments, grudges? Yes.
I'd like to think that everyone in this room would like to find out one answer, and that is, where's the sweater now?
Excellent question. So every time I get asked this question, I'm a little embarrassed to say that when Andrea and I were downsizing and moving, because it was hand spun, there were a lot of weak parts where it was thinnest, and it was starting to get a little bit holey. I should have probably turned it into oven mitts or something, but instead I just turned it into a story.
Okay, I'm going to jump in here. Andy, thank you again. That was absolutely wonderful. I wish we could do that every Friday night.
Thanks, Doug.
And as is our tradition at the Amos Fortune Forum, in our only way we can say thank you, here is a half-gallon of pure New Hampshire maple syrup for you.
Excellent. Thank you.
Thank you so much.
Yeah, thank you, Doug. Thank you. See you next door.
Join us next week. We have Jaffrey's own Chris Mayotte, who grew up in the area and has become quite an artist, and he will be here to tell his story and talk about his art. We hope to see you all there. And with that, this week's presentation is adjourned.